Welcome, everybody. I know we have folks joining from all over the country, friends from Trust for Learning, friends from Hunt Institute, from National Center for Montessori in the public sector. Thank you so much for being here. I am super duper excited about this conversation. Before we get started, just want to make sure you have your housekeeping in order. We are live streaming on a few different platforms, so you might be watching on LinkedIn or YouTube or Facebook. The way that you can engage in this conversation at any point is to just make a comment under wherever you're watching this video. So if you make that comment, there's some kind of magic happening behind the scenes where they all come into us. We will save the last 20 minutes or so of this conversation to get to your questions. I have a feeling people will have a lot, so we'll get to as many as we can. But feel free to do that anytime as you're listening in. And with that, I am so thrilled to welcome Dr. Nicki Bush. Nicki, feel free to come off of mute and on camera. Hello.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so thrilled to pick your brain. So just for everybody listening, I saw the review paper that we're going to talk about on Blue Sky a couple months ago, and what jumped out to me was that this paper synthesizes 70 years of research on stress in the early period of development and the wide-ranging and long-term effects and the mechanisms that we know about, like how stress gets under the skin. So I've been really excited to pick your brain on this. Before I jump into my questions, I want to just let everybody know a little bit more about your background. So for folks listening in, Nicki Bush, PhD, is the Lisa and John Pritzker Distinguished Professor of Developmental and Behavioral Health at UC San Francisco. She is jointly appointed in the departments of pediatrics and psychiatry and behavioral sciences, and is the division chief of the Division of Developmental Medicine. She is a senior fellow at the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. She is a leader on the NIH ECHO National Children's Health Study Consortium. She's also a licensed clinical psychologist who did her postdoctoral training in stress biology, pediatrics, and epidemiology, so pulling from multiple fields. She is an international expert in early childhood trauma and resilience and the importance of community engagement and culturally responsive approaches. So today our conversation will draw from her research on early childhood adversity and also the evidence-based interventions that I know all of us are so interested in and committed to on this call that can potentially protect against some of these biological and psychological impacts of stress in the early period of life. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. So good to have you. My first question is like, I know you're really busy, right? You probably are not just sitting around on extra, time. So what motivated you to take on this huge effort to synthesize 70 years of research?
Thanks for that amazing introduction. It feels so good to be seen for all of the hard work that we put in to get to this place in our careers and to have a chance to share it with you and everyone listening. So thanks for tuning in, everyone. I've been interested in this topic for a couple of decades now. It first started in graduate school when I was doing experimental studies with children and families, hooking them up to EKGs, stressing them out, and calming them down, and was fascinated by the fact that you could see a reaction under the skin that you couldn't always see on their faces or in their behavior, and that it was a window into what was going on for kids. And then in Chicago, lived in Chicago and worked in South and West Chicago public schools and after school programs, and really started to get the sense in those high stress communities I was placed in that the stress appeared to be making the children sick. And I went from there to complete those two postdocs that you mentioned, really trying to understand developmental stress biology, but also public health and epidemiology and how these things might be linked so that I could put all these thoughts and ideas together. And what struck me over the last decade in particular, as I became more expert, was how little people understand this, how little crosstalk there is across the fields where there is some evidence, and that even doctors or health policy experts didn't really know about the science, or they only knew about little pockets of it. And even though the volume and quality of the science on stress and health is rapidly increasing in the last couple of decades, so people are beginning to understand more, the understanding is pretty like it lacks nuance and
Mhm.
comprehensiveness, and also it's really predominantly focused on adults. So we think about stress and disease like heart disease or cancer, which typically doesn't evolve until later in our aging process. And so I got very interested in figuring out like, well, why is it so siloed? But the underlying systems affecting mental health and physical health are quite overlapping, in fact, often identical. And also, this stuff happens very early in life. So why aren't we looking at the evidence base before people are 40, 50, 60 to see what's going on? So that kind of background mixed with an incredible team of Dr. Ali Sullivan, who was a postdoc with me at the time, and Dr. Naranya Zhu, who was a research colleague on my team. We both, or the three of us, really wanted to tackle this challenge with encouragement of others who kept saying, is there a review paper you give me
Mhm.
to tell me I could read quickly to see what you're talking about? And I kept saying, no, there's not. And so we decided to write it. And in short, we found when we looked across these 150 different meta-analyses, other review papers, or in instances where there wasn't a meta-analysis or a review paper, we dug into specific studies. And we found that in general, across pediatric or child samples, that stress consistently was positively associated with poorer general functioning and health across a range of outcomes, mental and physical health, developmental outcomes, executive function, social and academic functioning, justice system involvement, and positive health outcomes. And that those associations tended to follow like a dose response gradient, where more stressors related to incrementally worse levels of problems.
Yeah,
That's
that's
the thing.
amazing. Yeah, and it reads so comprehensively and robustly. And I think one of the things that I really want to emphasize for people tuning in who may be coming from the perspective of running a childcare center, or they're a classroom teacher, or they're a state policymaker thinking about, preschool policy, the finding that these stress mechanisms influence, like it's even in the title, right? Biology, behavior, and health. That stress has these wide-ranging effects. Are there any other examples that are helpful to share for somebody who's tuning in to just sort of get that big picture? It's not just, okay, stress might make you feel stressed in sort of an emotional way. What are those different ways that it shows up?
Sure. So stress or the perception of something being threatening. It doesn't have to actually be a true threat. Even just our body's belief that we may be harmed or well-being is at stake activates this series of biological responses in our body that are actually great. These
Mm.
stress responses are our friend. They keep us alive. They activate our muscles and our digestion, and they calm us down and allow us to sleep and activate immune systems and heal. And so we love these systems. They are good things. They sometimes are vilified in stress research, but they're a good thing. But they can be activated, and it helps us adapt or cope with challenge or significant threats to optimize our chance of survival. And this can be a physical threat or a social threat because we are social creatures. And so we need social standing and status and protection from our community to survive. And so they're all very linked. And biological processes such as the fight or flight response helps prepare our bodies to fight or run by increasing our blood flow to our muscles or sharpening our perceptions or processes so we can respond really quickly to a challenge and either get out of there or save the day or something. And those biological activations affect our behaviors. It might increase hypervigilance or noticing and reacting to things in our environment. It might increase our avoidance, staying away from people or places. But it can also lead in modern society to things like stress eating or yelling at or hitting someone. And all of these are attempts to cope with anxiety or irritability that we might feel from that arousal. And that drive to eat more or be alert or yell at someone you feel threatened by might be evolutionarily adaptive.
Mm.
And yet, in our high calorie, non nutritious, abundant food environment, and when yelling and hitting are no longer typically required for survival, these things can be harmful to us. And so the chronic activation of those systems or engagement of a bunch of behaviors that might make sense in the short run, but be harmful in the long run, contribute to our risk of a whole range of health problems, whether those be depression, anxiety, obesity, asthma, relationship and justice system problems. And you can kind of put together how, oh, those things are linked together.
That's super helpful. Yeah. And as I was thinking about this conversation, I think sometimes there are these sort of folk knowledges or folk wisdom that we don't always take seriously, right? And what you've done is brought together, I think you mentioned 150 meta-analyses, right? In addition to other, or did I get that
Meta-analyses,
wrong?
reviews, or specific papers when there wasn't one. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So looking at all of these different empirical studies, right, across all of these different mechanisms that we're going to talk about more and synthesize them into a like profoundly important headline, right, about how these stressors impact people early in life in these wide-ranging ways. So I'm super excited to dig in on the mechanisms because I find them so interesting.
Yeah.
But before we even get there, like what is stress? Right? What counts as a stressor? Is it all equal? Talk us through like that landscape of stressors.
Sure. Well, I mean, we use it all the time in our like daily chat. It means a million. I'm so stressed out, and that's one meaning of stress, right? But the definition scientifically is that stress is the body's natural physical or psychological response to pressure, challenges, or threats. And that these things again activate that biological system. There are a series of systems that then reduce uh, our focus in other areas to optimize our focus and activities in others. And stress can be short term, like an acute event that happens once and is over quickly, or it can be chronic, something that is enduring, such as poverty, which tends to not be like a one-day event, or divorce. It might be final on one day, but the ramifications of divorce can be challenging for some families for many years to come, sometimes decades.
Mhm.
And not all stress is bad. As I said, a stress response helps me be able to answer your questions and respond with energy. I'm all fired up because my heart is a little bit activated, my cortisol is circulating. It's really a good thing. If I am about to run a race, I want to feel anxious and stressed so that I can get as much blood flow to my muscles and win that race, hopefully. And so stress is actually not all bad. And when it's controllable,
Mhm.
something you take on intentionally, or when it's tolerable, maybe you didn't wish it happened, but you have the resources either within yourself or in your immediate circumstance, or you can tap someone else for the resource you need to buffer the stress, then it's considered controllable or tolerable. But if a stress is unpredictable, very
Mhm.
significant, or enduring, and you don't have capacity to buffer that stress effect through protective relationships or um, abilities to reduce that stress and rest and recover, then it can be considered very harmful and potentially toxic. It's a
Mhm.
word we hesitate to use in the field because toxic stress implies that it definitely will hurt you or that it's always bad. And so I use that term cautiously, but it is a commonly understood toxic stress is something that people have started to pay attention to. So toxic
Mhm.
stress is typically pretty bad for most people.
Mhm. Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about, our ability as adults to have more control over some of our stressors, right? We have more agency, more resources at our disposal to try to manage our stress. But this review looks at these early developmental periods, and you're in early childhood world with folks on this call, so we'll especially focus on
Great.
the prenatal and infancy to early childhood phases that you've looked at. But just to remind people of this idea of sensitive periods, right? If we're thinking about the prenatal period or babies and toddlers, how are those early years, prenatal to preschool, uniquely sensitive to stressors? And of course, those are the years when children they don't have as many ways to manage their own stressors, right? They're relying on their families and ecosystems and caregivers to do that.
Yeah. Well, I love your focus on perinatal and early childhood. It's my favorite area of focus too. It appears that stress across the entire life course has the potential to impact our well-being and health. So, it's not that stress at other times is fine, but when the organism is developing, it's more vulnerable to changes that could be made in its development that can be enduring. I like to use the example of if you have a little tree sapling and it's growing and it doesn't have enough sunlight or water and a little bit of toxins get sprinkled in the soil around it, that sapling is going to be stunted or not optimally developed. It might grow crooked, it might grow really shriveled, and it's never going to reach its fullest potential. But if you have a full grown 30-foot tree and you put the same amount of environmental stressor
Mhm.
on that full grown tree, it may affect the tree, it may lose some leaves, or it may, not fruit in the same way, but it's not going to have the same kind of impact. And so developing bodies in human organisms are very similar. And the prenatal period or the fetal development period is incredibly important. And I read a different review a couple years ago on the role of stress during pregnancy, maternal experience of stress, how that's transmitted to the fetus while it's developing. And the reason that that happens is developmental origins of health and disease. The framework suggests that a baby could be born anywhere on the planet. It could be born in a hot climate. It could be born where there's lots of food or very little nutrition. It could be born somewhere where there's a ton of stress or very little stress. And the hormones that the mother transmit through the placenta through her maternal fetal transmission educate the developing fetus, okay, put some energy here. We have a limited
Mhm.
amount of cellular energy, right? So you want to invest it in the ways that are going to be optimizing survival once the baby is born. And so it tailors the development of that fetus to some degree to thrive in the world to come. But sometimes there's a mismatch between that, or maybe it will help the baby reach survival, but lead to chronic disease later in life. And so that's one of the reasons that fetal development is such an important time, both for the person carrying the baby and the pregnant person, but also for the baby. But also early childhood, there's still a ton going on. I mean, there's so much brain development, the bones and the muscles and the teeth and all the things are coming. And so, again, it's a very important period in which adversity or pro-social supportive experiences, relational support are critical. And as you've mentioned, um, children don't have the ability to regulate their own emotions or their stress response or to save themselves when they're very young. And they're quite dependent on their caregiver relationship. It doesn't have to be a biological parent. It could be kin, it could be a preschool teacher. In fact, often children spend more time and are quite attached to care providers who are not from their family.
Mm.
Those relationships are critical to that early biological development and
Mhm.
subsequent behavioral, mental, and physical health development.
Mm. Yeah, that's really helpful. And for folks listening in, this is a good moment to ask yourself if you have any questions or comments that you want to put in the chat. We'll start collecting those. So this next set of questions I was slightly nervous about because I want to actually pull up a figure from your paper and walk people through it. Because I think it really beautifully captures the synthesis of what we know, even if we don't have all of the questions answered yet about all of these mechanisms for how stress gets under the skin. But to kind of walk people through that, like what does the literature say at this point? So Jihan, if you can pull that up on the screen, we're just going to kind of walk through it with people. So you you depict like a ton of research in a fairly simple way, and I'm just going to kind of flash this up on screen once we have it, and then walk people through something. But as we get it up, tell us what a moderator is, because we're going to start at the top. What is a moderator in scientific terms?
So first, I'm going to say that I keep talking about how adversity can lead to these bad outcomes. It's not deterministic, though. It doesn't have the
Mm,
same effect on absolutely everyone. So someone could have no adversity and have poor health, or they could have a lot of adversity and be very healthy. And part of the reason that happens is because there's things along this process of exposure and outcome that affect whether or not the exposure has that impact. And
mm,
so a moderator is a thing, either in the person or in their environment, that changes the relationship between the exposure and the outcome. So, for example, if a child is exposed to a lot of stress, but has a warm, nurturing caregiver who's able to provide them reassurance, safety, and get them out of that negative situation and help them cope with their immediate stress response and trust that they're safe moving forward, that's very buffering. And there may be no impact on that child's biology or mental or physical health later because of that moderating factor of parenting or the parent-child relationship.
fantastic. Yeah. And obviously, we won't go through all of these, but I just want people to sort of like glance over these different moderators. And these all are all based on papers, studies, perhaps meta-analyses,
Yeah.
looking at what are those factors that help determine whether that stress exposure or how much that stress exposure is going to have a measurable effect later in life. So, are there any others that you want to just highlight for people here that
Yeah,
give another
let
good
me just
example?
share a couple that have, particularly strong or relevant for your audience. Age matters. So earlier in time appears to be a stronger relationship between adversity and outcome. individual differences and children's kind of temperamental, biological, and behavioral reactivity and their ability to regulate. We're all born like a little bit different in that regard. It can be shaped over time due to our experience, but we all kind of show up with a little different set of abilities at the beginning, and that can really affect how strongly families and children are impacted. And I mentioned the caregiver-child relationship. We have really great data to show that preschool teachers, kindergarten teachers, first grade teachers can be very protective. Teacher-child closeness can be buffering for kids who have family violence at home. It can prevent the association between that family adversity exposure and children's stress biology or their physical health outcome in first grade. And so there's lots of layers, whether it be in the child, immediately outside of them through caregiving environment, or even more distal, like in the classroom. It can be very buffering. And even neighborhoods, we looked at objective levels of neighborhood quality through 26 or 29 publicly available indicators, geospatially linked it. And we found that the risk between poverty and children's biology was buffered when they lived in better neighborhoods. And so there could be macro level factors that we can invest in neighborhoods, and it can be protective for kids who experience individual risks.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for walking through that. I think so many of us on this call may already be working really deeply in one or two of these areas, but having this sort of bigger picture, right, of the things that, many of the things on this screen, we all kind of know are good for children, right? But if we additionally know that investing in them can protect against other stressors that may be outside of a family's control or outside even of policymakers' control, that's really helpful. Yeah. Okay. So this is
Love
kind
that
of
you
top
get
level.
that. Yeah. There's
Yeah.
so many ways to help. I love to frame. There's so many places to support families experiencing adversity. Yeah.
Yeah, and I fear sometimes everybody listening on this call is working incredibly hard on early childhood, investing in nurturing relationships, increasing funding for early childhood programs. So we're very much among friends here. But that sense of solidarity, right? That even if I can't figure out all the things to do with nutrition, right, that we're all in this together to support children and buffer them, protect them as much as we possibly can against some of the stressors that families are facing in this country. Um, Okay, so this is a lot of information, but I just wanted to see this nice kind of encapsulation of a few different levels that may be interacting to
Mhm.
influence children's health. So again, we won't go through everything, but what are a few kind of pathways that you could point out to people as examples of how these different levels interact?
A lot of the evidence coming from the field of psychology or behavioral health really focuses on that caregiving relationship. And that's important because it's one of the primary relationships of importance to developing children. However, it's really important to understand that caregiving, whether it be by parents or preschool teachers or other educators, it's not happening in a vacuum.
Mm,
It's happening in the context of the community they live within, the inequities in income or social opportunity or harm through things such as racism that affect caregivers' capacity to show up and be as nurturing as possible. And I want to be careful when I say that because some folks who are growing up without financial, or sorry, raising children without financial resources or having a ton of stress are still remarkably fabulous caregivers. And so it's not to say that people experiencing social adversity or more challenges in their community aren't amazing parents, but it does make it 10 times harder for them to show up in a supportive, responsive, sensitive manner with their kids. And it could be very taxing to them. And it might mean that they're not as sensitive or responsive or not as available as they'd like to be for their children. And so the goal of this is to show the layers of the more societal policies, structural and institutional factors and big events. We've got a lot going. We're in a war right now. We've got pandemics we just went through, election stress, all of those things play out into effect the risks for children being exposed to adversity in that kind of purple column and potentially the caregiving behaviors that they're exposed to. And it might affect whether or not they go to a quality childcare or go to primary care prevention appointments and pediatrics and those things too. And that all of those play a role. There's links between the red column and the green, the purple and the green, the blue and the green, but often if you unpack it, it goes through this process.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know just from knowing our partners that we really do have people listening in who are deeply invested in many of the different levels to support children. And yeah, again, that we need to be thinking holistically and advancing progress on all fronts, right? We need to be working on structural racism, and that is a long fight. We're in a backlash right now,
Yep.
right? What are the things we can do today while we also fight those larger and longer fights?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do
Um,
kind of wish we'd added sexism to the left column because I think there's other
Yeah,
isms, you know, in intersectionality that contribute to the challenges that caregivers face.
absolutely. And you do a wonderful job in the paper of giving some examples of how some of these macro stressors, like low, household income or sort of being under-resourced financially, can have cascading effects and interactions across many, many other factors, right? So those big capital P policy investments that we could be making, right, can have cascading effects for children's
Exactly.
well-being. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I could go into so much detail on all of these, but I want to get into this bottom section.
Yeah.
And as a preview for everybody, Nikki is going to be on our podcast, and we're going to go a bit deeper into some of these mechanisms. But for me, this is where in the last 10, 20, 30 years, we have begun to understand, still many things to figure out, some of the really nitty-gritty mechanisms of
Yeah.
how actually stressors are impacting development. So we're not going to go through all of them,
Yeah.
but bear with us, folks listening. We will unpack some of the scientific terms. Um, let's start with one that is like, it was in the headlines quite a bit a few years ago. Super interested in it. We're going to talk about it on the podcast. So epigenetic mechanisms. Let's start by saying, what even are epigenetic
Great
mechanisms?
question.
What does that have to do with this idea of like biological aging? Like, introduce us to even that word.
Sure. So epigenetics is the study of how behaviors and environmental factors like diet, stress, or lifestyle causes changes in how our genes work without actually changing the underlying DNA sequence. So your genes don't change, but there's modifications, things such as DNA methylation or histone modification that can turn genes on or off. So you might have a gene that places you at risk for a problem, but it might get turned off by epigenetics, or it might be allowed to uh, transcript lots of proteins that relate to problems. And so you can think of epigenetics as kind of the layer over genetics that play a major role in whether or not genes are activated. And epigenetic clocks or epigenetic aging is a really interesting thing that came about in the relatively recent scientific literature in relation to the stress space, because there were groups of folks who have found different places of our genome where certain methylation marks, whether they're there or not, are highly correlated with our chronological age. So if a child is 6, their epigenetic age is probably very highly correlated with that.
Mm,
But an epigenetic clock can tell us whether or not their aging is faster than expected given their chronological age, or their biological aging is slower than expected given their chronological age. And in
mm,
adults, we've found that a history of trauma is very correlated with increased epigenetic aging, so accelerated aging. And that's been well demonstrated with a lot of studies and meta-analyses and review papers. And they've found more and more evidence in recent years that this is also correlated with epigenetic aging in children. But
mm,
what's more interesting is that accelerated epigenetic aging, being biologically older than your chronological age, is correlated with cardiovascular disease, metabolic risk, cancer, mental health problems. And so it suggests that it's a wonderful marker for us to understand adversity exposure and whether or not it's affecting that person's biology, and
mm,
helps us understand their risk for later disease outcomes.
mm. I want to unpack that a little bit. So Trust for Learning, where I serve as one of the co-directors, we think and we fund through this framework of what we call ideal learning environments. And the final principle of that, we think about equity and relationships and play. Um, The final principle is really philosophical, and it's the idea that the time of childhood is valued, right? We're not just investing in children so that down the road, they contribute to the economy, but that it's really important for children to have their time as children. We know from the brain literature that there's some evidence that children are moving more quickly through some of their sensitive phases of brain maturation
Yeah,
in response to stressors, and that it could be adaptive, right? Which you talked about earlier. But this idea, right, that stress is actually speeding children up through their childhoods on some level that we're seeing epigenetically or in the brain. Talk through again, just to highlight for people how that could be adaptive, potentially short term, but maybe not adaptive long term. How do we kind of think about that? Because I
sure.
fear there could be a response that's like, oh, great, they're growing up faster. They're like developing even faster, like we're racing through development or something.
The
So yeah, how do we
evidence
think about it?
The evidence is still being pulled together in childhood. Like I said, it's newer to study this in kids because most of the science is focused on adults and most of those focus on males. And we're just kind of catching up as a society, realizing we should be studying this earlier and earlier. And some colleagues recently developed a specific pediatric epigenetic clock that was
Mm,
not trying to use adult data to predict epigenetic aging in kids. And that was just recently done in the last decade. So it takes a while to catch up with what we know in adults. But the suggestion is that accelerated aging could be advantageous. It might help us get out of the house earlier. It might help us be bigger, stronger. It might help us be mature sooner, to procreate, to pass on our genes. So evolutionarily, that accelerated aging, early puberty, for example, allowing us to procreate and pass our genes on, maybe evolutionarily adaptive if our genes want us to keep propagating ourselves. However, early puberty is also a risk factor for problems, especially in girls, a whole range of problems. And although it may have some advantages in some settings, it may be harmful for other outcomes. And so we can't say universally whether this accelerated aging is good or bad. It really depends on the context, on the outcome we're interested in, and also individual differences. So for some people, it might be just fine to accelerate their development, might lead to great things. However, I will share that typically trauma is associated with accelerated epigenetic aging, but not
mm.
necessarily advanced cognitive development. It's usually associated with cognitive delay. And so let's not equate biological aging with brain development because it's actually the opposite.
Hmm. Yeah, and this is not my expertise, but the idea that if you're moving more quickly through a sensitive period, that you may be shortening your window for those really critical inputs around language or emotional development or
Exactly.
whatever the period might be.
And people
Um,
treat you differently and
mm,
expect things of you that you may not have had time to develop the skills to respond in a way expected by society.
mhm. Okay, so epigenetics, epigenetic clock, one mechanism that we
Mhm.
know about. I want to talk about a couple more. So I think people have heard of the HPA axis, right? Even this morning, I was like, what does it stand for again? Making sure I remembered. So, what is the HPA axis? What do we know about how stress might change how it develops, especially in these really early years?
So the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, let's just call it that moving forward, is the body's primary slow-acting stress response system. And it initiates this hormone cascade. It starts with the hypothalamus in the brain, which produces CRH. That sends a signal to the pituitary gland, which produces ACTH. And then that sends a signal to the adrenal glands and says, hey, produce cortisol, among other hormones. And the goal is that that secreted cortisol and other factors are released into the body to help the body or the individual manage stress, increase blood glucose, and regulate metabolism. And the HPA axis uses a negative feedback loop to kind of tell itself up at the hypothalamus again, okay, we have enough, we're good, you can stop, we're not. And high levels of cortisol really are critical for responding to threats. As I said, it can activate blood pressure and slow digestion so that we can focus our energy on things that might help us cope with the challenge in the moment. But chronic long-term activation of the HPA axis can lead to a variety of compensatory activities in either that system or other systems that are trying to bring our body back to homeostasis or healthy balance. Because you
Mhm.
cannot have the gas pedal on all day, all night for days and days. You're going to run out of gas and blow out the engine, right? I mean, that's a rough analogy of bodies, but we just cannot maintain that activation. So the body will kind of downregulate. And
Mhm.
that long activation can lead to risk for things like anxiety and depression, burnout, cognitive and memory problems, but also things like endocrine and metabolic disorders, type 2 diabetes, high blood sugar, but also things such as cardiovascular issues, high blood pressure, musculoskeletal problems, skin problems, chronic pain, reproductive issues. And our review that we're talking about today found that adversity exposure was well associated pretty robustly with flatter overall cortisol levels during the day. And like I said, cortisol is good. You want to have a sharp awakening response that helps you get out of bed, have energy, go to school, learn, play, make friends, say sorry, help with the dishes, depending on your age. And then you want it to go down at the end of the night so that your body can rest and sleep and repair and immune system can come on board. But we find that adversity is associated with a flatter overall output during the day. So they're not waking up with as much gusto and they're not lowering as much as they need to for high quality sleep. But also that adversity in childhood is associated with kind of a dampened HPA axis response. So again, that blunted, not as functional, not as responsive to acute stressors. And things such as our hair, we can measure cortisol in hair, blood, saliva, but hair shows us arousal over the last 3 months. And some of the data there really suggests that it leads to chronic activation via hair. So
Mm.
HPA axis is pretty important and there's a lot of evidence in it.
Mm. That was a fantastic explanation. Yeah. And obviously, all of these systems are connected, very
Right.
closely connected. And you have described these kind of cascading effects, like from, hormones to systems. The brain, of course, is involved. Let's just talk about one more mechanism that we are learning more about in terms of how stress influences it. So, the autonomic nervous system.
Sure.
Unpack that piece of it.
So the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, is another component of the body's response. It's associated with the peripheral nervous system, and that regulates involuntary bodily functions. So things such as our heart beating, digestion, respiration. So we're not thinking about those things, right, Ellen? It just happens, thank goodness. And it tries to help us maintain homeostasis. Again, balance of energy. We need food, we need digestion, we need rest, and just really calibrating our body. It operates without conscious control. And it has two kind of arms, the sympathetic or fight or flight dominant component, or parasympathetic, which is the component that helps us rest and digest. And the ANS innervates pretty much every major organ or organs in our body. It's critical for our survival, it keeps us alive. And it controls smooth muscles and cardiac muscles and glands to regulate temperature, metabolism, all these things. And it typically operates where the sympathetic nervous system activates heartbeat, so heart rate would go faster, whereas the parasympathetic would help you calm. If you have a startle response, your heart starts racing. That's your SNS going, hey, we're ready to fight. If you're in yoga and you're practicing your slow breathing and sitting there with your eyes closed and your heart slows down, that's your parasympathetic coming online saying, oh, we're safe, we're calm, we're really gonna optimize your relaxation right now. And that allows you to digest and activate the immune system and heal and repair. And so chronic arousal due to stress can lead to wear and tear in any system. Like I said, it can happen with the HPA axis, but it also can impact the ANS and lead to poorer functioning overall. And there's a lot less evidence in this realm in childhood. And part of that is because it's very complicated to hook up kids to 7 different EKG leads. One, they don't like it when they're young. I've done this with infants all the way through age 6. And it's really hard with toddlers because, they love to say no. But we do it with dolls. But there's less data. But the data we have suggests that in particular, adversity is associated with parasympathetic nervous system, or that ability to calm, rest, and digest and calm oneself. And leads to poorer functioning in that system. And there's some evidence also in the sympathetic or fight or flight arm. And in particular, we had a study showing that greater poverty or socioeconomic low resource was associated with kind of a blunted or poorer fight or flight response to stressors and less ability to recover. But not only that, but it seemed to shape that system over the kindergarten year. So some evidence that it's changing their trajectories for that fight or flight response system. And the ANS is less well understood in childhood health problems, but it's been linked to psychiatric and mental health conditions, neurodevelopmental conditions, and physical conditions like chronic pain and autoimmune disorders.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm just imagining, children who are very, very young, struggling with some of this regulation. I study emotion regulation, right? And it can be really hard to regulate ourselves even in the best of circumstances, even as adults, right? But especially if we are young and don't always have the resources to fully regulate. And then to, we think about ideal learning environments and how to respond to all children and meet them where they are. What is that learning environment meeting that child, right? Who may be struggling with regulation for any number of reasons. And how do we meet them where they are rather than make it worse, right? Not structuring our learning environments to further stress out children. Um,
Well,
so
if I
yeah,
can just add to that, I love what you just said, but also just to help people understand that sometimes when the kid shows up like this, it's beyond their control. It's an involuntary autonomic nervous system or HPA axis system response to their challenges they're facing in another setting, perhaps. And
mm.
so to not see that child as doing it on purpose, I think is an important part.
Yeah, absolutely. So last week we were a little bit on the flip side of this coin. We talked with Kathy Hirsch-Pasek about really the how of how children develop in nurturing, warm relationships. Yeah, the trust and with our partners, we think about those ideal learning environments that are grounded in these beautiful, warm, nurturing relationships. Um, I love that this was not just a doom and gloom review, right? You talk about, okay, here's what we know about all these stress mechanisms. Here are things we still don't know. But you also talk about the evidence base for either, interventions or policy investments that we know can protect children against these stressors. So we'll pull up just one more image here. For people listening in, many of the people on this call touch directly into some of these systems. Either they're an educator or they might be a policymaker working to protect or expand these programs. But just kind of talk to us about what the research says about the kinds of public investments that either can actually reduce stress for children or keep using this word buffer,
Yeah.
protect children if we can't fully control the stress around them.
Yeah, so we pulled the information used in this graphic from the Prenatal to Three Policy Impact Center. So I want to give them a shout out. They're out of Vanderbilt. Their website is amazing. And this was like an interpretation of some of their information. And the goal of this was to really show that there are policies that either directly or indirectly support caregiver and child well-being and all of can buffer, the risks from adversity. And some of the most robust evidence base comes from things such as paid family or medical leave. And part of the process of how is that related to stress biology? Well, if you think about it, pregnant people go through incredible biological, emotional, hormonal, and lifestyle changes while they're pregnant, but also, up to a year, maybe even longer postpartum. There's been some great studies on pregnant brains and how much they change, immune systems, all of that. And so if we don't allow enough leave for their bodies to repair, they are and rest, they're at risk of depression or other challenging health outcomes that can lead to their own impairment, that can have longstanding impacts on both their outcomes, but also their ability to optimally caregive. But also that you mentioned your last speaker, it also allows the caregivers, whether it be paternity leave, maternity leave, to be home with that young person and develop a nurturing relationship, perhaps increase likelihood of breastfeeding, increase capacity to teach self-regulation, to form a strong bond early in life while they are recovering and those neurons are, developing at such an incredible rate for the baby. It's an incredibly important time to invest in, and America does a very bad job relative to other developed countries in the world. And so this is an area I love to emphasize. But early intervention services, early Head Start for families that might need a little more support in that early childhood period have a pretty robust evidence base in the areas. There's less linkage to biological outcomes with those particular interventions, but we have some data that we think generalizes really well in that space. But this just highlights things that are maybe less studied, like community-based doulas can, improve birth outcomes for the birthing person, for the baby, and also reduce risk of PTSD or postpartum depression. So all things that are costly to society. And we should just do a little bit of investment to prevent these long term, large costs to the caregiver and the child. But we have some
Okay.
other stuff that I'm really excited to share. For example, there's early intervention services, just to give two examples from our own projects. We have a pregnancy period stress reduction,
Hmm.
group-based psychosocial stress reduction wellness promotion intervention called Mamas. And 8-week groups with about 8 to 10 women. It led to clinically significant reductions in depression during pregnancy. Those reductions in depression lasted 8 years. Even during the pandemic, women who were in intervention relative to treatment as usual showed lower depression, lower clinical risk.
Wow.
But more striking, we were able to show that the babies born to women who had received the pregnancy intervention had better fight or flight responses, stress reactivity. We
Mhm.
hooked them up to those EKGs I talked about, and better ability to regulate after a stressor during
Mm.
infancy than the treatment as usual families. And we have some stuff coming out to show that those effects have implications for children's mental health. That's being written up right now. So we have some cool findings to show that a pregnancy psychosocial intervention can have 2 generation benefits for up to 8 years, which is very exciting. And on the flip side, what if the baby's already been born? We have some beautiful data in partnership with the Child Trauma Research Program. Alicia Lieberman and her colleagues have developed an intervention called Child Parent Psychotherapy, which is a trauma focused dyadic caregiver child therapy that has a very well established evidence base for improving parent child relationship and therapeutic outcomes in children. But we recently were able to show, and this paper was led by Ali Sullivan and Sarah Merrill, and we showed that child parent psychotherapy led to slower or reductions in trauma related cellular aging at
Mhm.
the end of the quasi experimental study period of about 1 year. So the two groups looked the same before therapy or around a comparable time in the community comparison group, but about a year later, the kids who were in the community comparison group showed increased epigenetic aging, whereas the kids who received CPP did not. So suggesting that trauma therapy can buffer epigenetic aging risk. So lots
Mhm.
of places to point to where supporting the caregiver-child relationship can improve biology in kids as well as well-being and mental and physical health outcomes.
Thank you so much for reviewing those specific findings. One thing that I struggle a bit with, so I'm curious just to hear you talk about this, is sometimes these intervention studies give us such beautiful evidence for investigating those mechanisms, right? Either we had some mechanistic information from animal models, but we try something, right? And we see that there's a difference between the control group and the experimental group. I fear sometimes that a policymaker could take a finding like that and think, okay, we have to go convince every single person to stop being so stressed out, right? And we ignore the macro factors that are like
Mhm.
stressing all of these people who are pregnant out. So how do you balance that kind of like, the individual level of intervention and those big picture policy interventions? Yeah, I'm just curious like how you think about that because I
It's
want
such a great
policymakers to
question.
hear the
It's
mechanism.
such a challenge. I always say that I really hate that sometimes my work could be interpreted as, oh, if parents would just be better parents, or if they'd be less stressed, we wouldn't have all these health problems. And that is the absolute opposite of what I'm trying to show. The beauty of the intervention studies with caregivers are that there's such a focus on how bad caregiving or stress leads to bad things for them and their kids. And my goal was to say, we can take that phenomenon and flip it. We can
Mm,
do good things and help caregivers feel better, and it has great benefits. So, one thing was just to prove this isn't just a negative direction, it can be used for the
mhm,
positive. And so, if society would just wake up and understand, it also gives us more causal information to show that this is actually controlling this outcome. So when you manipulate the stress through an
mhm,
intervention, it gives you more confidence, like, oh, it is the stress that's causing it. We should probably prevent that. So
mhm,
obviously it would be far superior to prevent major adversity, interpersonal violence, sexual trauma, um, huge income disparities that lead to poverty and insufficient resources to even feed and house yourself. That's ridiculous in our society that we live with so many people and children in particular. I think it's 1 in 5, struggle with that. It's really silly. It's foolish. It's more than silly. It's horrible that we allow that. And this data, the goal, even though it's focused on these dyads or focused at this level, is to really highlight that point.
mhm,
And the goal is to keep talking to policymakers and get them to see this science and be thinking, oh gosh, maybe if I did create an environment where caregivers had the leave they needed, had the high quality childcare they need to feel good about dropping their kid off to go have a fulfilling job where they earn enough wage to come home and then support their family and then feel, rested, not have to work 2 jobs. They feel rested enough to greet their child with joy and enthusiasm, and then everyone's healthy and we actually save dollars as a society social impact is really important, but some folks are motivated by money. We can save a
Mm,
lot of money if we can cut this off at the pass. I would love to not have to do trauma therapy or have those programs exist, but we have to kind of stop the pipeline of adversity first. And in the interim, until that happens, we need solutions on the table now that people can look to.
mm. Thank you. Okay, we have just 10 minutes left. We do have a couple good questions
Sure.
that I will throw your way. But before that, is there anything else you want to share that I haven't asked you that you want people listening in to take away from this?
I think it's kind of mostly what you just asked me, just to reiterate, we have tools immediately that we know work.
Hmm. Hmm.
The science is really strong. We need to stop thinking that it's just a mental health thing. Stress is a health thing. Mental health is
Hmm.
health.
Hmm.
And we have a lot of work to do as a society to put our money in the right places if we want to have a healthy population.
Hmm. Okay, we're getting more questions coming in. If you have one and you haven't sent it in, feel free. We'll fit in as many as we can. A diversity of questions here about some of the different ways that stressors and investments can support or buffer stress. So one interesting one that we haven't touched on much, and speak to it to the extent you feel comfortable. Somebody writes, I'm wondering how a child's diet plays into this, right? Because I don't know if we would think of diet as a stress
Yeah.
factor exactly. Food and the way that it's processed has changed so much, even in the span of our lifetimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, how do you think about nutrition, food, the quality of food that children have access to right now in this bigger picture?
That's a really good question. I actually am a huge proponent of diet as an important intervention. I am not an expert in it scientifically. And so we looked at social factors predominantly. Nutrition is related to social factors, of course, but in itself is not social. There is evidence not in this review, but in other domains I'm familiar with, things such as decreasing high sugar and the diet can improve a range of health outcomes. It can improve symptoms for ADHD in some studies, increasing different things such as folic acid can change methylation. There's mouse studies where it can totally change activation of a gene that makes mice yellow and obese and lazy,
Hmm.
as
Hmm.
opposed to when they didn't have that nutritional supplementation, or when they did have the nutritional supplementation, they were lean and fast and
Hmm. Hmm.
smart mice and all the studies that they ran. So there's a good evidence that nutrition is incredibly powerful.
Hmm. All right, I'll hit on a few of these others. And again, these may be outside of your own expertise, but we can share whatever we know. We've gotten a couple of questions about raising children in wartime, raising children in schools where there are threats that need to be prepared for practically. And I'm curious if you have, thoughts or any research around some of the best ways to protect children who are under that kind of threat of violence in a systematic way. And of my own perspective on this is like, what are the roots of the roots of the violence that children are threatened by, if not experiencing, and how do we stand up to protect children against them? But until we're able to do that, do you have any thoughts on this? Somebody specifically asked about preventing or reducing the long-term impacts of war-related stress,
Yeah.
and also preparing children for drills through drills in their schools for
It's a really
acts of
important
violence.
question. It's one that I don't have specific scientific expertise in, but I can speak kind of adjacent to that. The effects of stress on the body are very similar across a range of stressors. The more intense and the more frightening the stressor, the bigger the response. So we know that wartime or threat of active shooters is terrible for bodies. However, reducing exposure to content about it
Hmm.
can be very helpful. So protecting your kids' exposure to news. Some people have the news on in the background all day, all night, and that news is not meant for little brains. It's really not meant for adult brains either, like that chronic,
Yeah.
threat response that the news channels can give us. So one thing, the literature, when 9/11 happened, I was a grad student and we were studying, the effects of exposure to 9/11 were related to how much media parents had on in the home. So, we've known for a long time that this is a problem. So reducing exposure is really important. Reassuring children in any way you can that's realistic and authentic about how you or others can protect them, or that they are not at risk, or if feasible.
Hmm.
And not to plan and be hypervigilant about it all the time, but to acknowledge that it's there. So some people will not talk about it, but the kids know. They can feel you're stressed about it. They can see it on the news, they hear about it at school. And so not talking about it isn't good either. So it's tough to know. It depends on the individual child and their anxiety level, their developmental maturity. There's a lot written about this, I think, on the internet. There's some really good spaces. I know there's people in the American Academy of Pediatrics that are writing about this in particular, to calibrate how you manage it based on the individual factors, and whether or not you actually know someone in the war zone, you are in the war zone yourself versus you're just watching a lot of news about it, all just calibrates how you have to respond. But the biggest thing is to find healthy, nurturing relationships are very buffering for any kind of adversity. Exercise, diet, sleep, those things are all really important for our bodies and our stress responses.
Yeah, that's a great overview of how to think about it. I do think there are organizations that have really good developmentally appropriate resources out there for schools to think about exactly this question, right? How do the adults in the room strategically, prepare and make sure that everybody's going to be safe without transmitting that stress and fear to children? So there are resources out there. I don't have them
Yeah, it's not my
offhand.
area of expertise. My personal thought is that I don't love active shooter drills. I think
Yeah.
I can't imagine there's a net positive there, but I don't have any science to back that up.
Yeah. And it's just such a hard question to even talk about. But I do trust that there are educators out there who've put out really good resources, possibly folks in the ideal learning ecosystem that we know about, so we could share those in our newsletter. I'm just going to do maybe one or two other questions. Actually, building on what you were just sharing, and I know this might be us kind of sharing something that we didn't necessarily prepare to, but one of the really big formative studies for so much of the field that you reference in the study, the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, gives us some insight, into some of the developmental timing of both stressors on children at a population level, and this is really in the framework of neglect, but
Mm.
also when we intervene by supporting children in nurturing relationships, how much progress we see. So that's something for folks reading the paper. First of all, let me just say, read the paper. It's so good. It's so readable, right? Like I love to read science papers, but even if you don't, it's really, really readable. But that is highlighted. So I'll just direct people to the paper there, Nikki, unless you want to say anything else about that. But it's a population level set of research that we are all learning from.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting set of studies because it had a naturalistic trauma exposure and then random assignment to foster care that allows us to kind of understand this in a scientific way. And I appreciate the compliment on the paper. Allie and Amanda and I worked really hard to make it readable because our goal was not to have just our friends read it or my mom, but to have people who need this information to make decisions that impact families. And for it to be, although it's scientific, we tried really hard to keep it kind of succinct. And that there's opportunities to dig into any of those studies further if you want, but we kept it kind of brief just to be like, this is a thing. Oh, and childcare environments. And, I wish there had been more literature when we started the review around early childcare settings. I struggled to find it in the same way that I was readily able to find other domains. And I think that area is growing and it's really important. Caregivers across all realms of a child's life are incredibly important for kids, and their mental health and well-being is incredibly important for the kids they provide care for. So we need to make sure they have a living wage and that they have great work environments and that we can prioritize the value of their work, because it's some of the most important work on the planet.
Absolutely. As anecdotal evidence, so in the ideal learning ecosystem, we hear reports from our partners who are running play-based, relational, warm, beautiful early childhood environments that they see much lower rates of burnout amongst their educators. So that's something we don't have a ton of data for, but we hope to actually start collecting that data. Um, oh gosh, I could seriously pick your brain all
We
day.
could talk for hours.
Well, we will pull up our final slides. Yeah, anything else that you want to share as we wrap up, and then we'll kind of plug giving people a link to the paper so they can read it. And yeah, I'm just so grateful for your work, and hopefully this was helpful to people. And I'll say we had a bunch of questions that we couldn't get to. So I think people are really interested in learning from the scientists who are actually doing the very detailed and hard work to make sense of this.
Well, thank you so much. I would say the take home I want is, and I appreciate you highlighted this earlier, Stress is bad, but not for everyone. It's not deterministic, and there's lots we can do about it, both to stop it from occurring in the first place, but also to buffer its effects on our health. That mental health is health, and that we need to be investing in these protective environments across layers of society, and that doing it early is going to have a way bigger bang for our buck on social and economic impact than waiting until folks have developed heart disease and asthma. So thanks for caring. And I know so much of this audience, I'm preaching to the choir. So thanks for the work that you guys do out there. It's incredibly important. And hopefully this empowers you to keep it up.
Thank you. Okay, so take a picture of this QR code to actually read the paper. We'll send it out when we send out the recording, and we'll just go to the final slide to plug. We have another conversation coming up with Roberta Golinkoff, famed language researcher. That'll be coming up in April. And then Nicki is one of my guests on the new podcast that we're launching, where we're actually going even a bit deeper into some of these mechanisms because we hear about epigenetics, epigenetic aging, HPA axis, right? And I really am excited to help people feel confident about what we know, what we don't know, and why it matters for young children, especially in the very, very early sensitive periods of life. So stay tuned for all of that. You can join the Trust listserv. Nicki, thank you. Thank you to National
Yeah.
Center for Monitoring the Public Sector, Hunt Institute. We appreciate you. And yeah, more soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.